first thing we're going to talk about is simplification. This is what you have when you have a fraction that is shown in it is not shown in its lowest terms, and you reduce it to its lowest terms. So let's look at an example. Let's take the fraction 2 over 4. Now, it's pretty obvious that this is not in its lowest reduced terms. What you can actually do to this fraction is you can write the numerator and the denominator in terms of its multiples. So in this case, 2 can be written as 1 times 2, and 4 can be written as 2 times 2. Now you notice that 2 over 2 is equal to 1, so those cancel out, and we are left with the fraction 1/2. That is how you reduce a fraction to its lowest terms. Now let's look at a second example that's a little bit more difficult. Let's take the fraction 6 over 63. Now this is the same as writing 6 times 1 over 63 times 1, but you can break that down even further and say 6 is 3 times 2, and 63 is 21 times 3. Now as you see, we have a 3 on the numerator and 3 on the denominator, and we are left with the fraction 2 over 21. All right, now in that a similar vein, let's look at some improper fractions. And let's look at improper fractions. And let's convert these into some mixed numbers. So let's take the fraction 3/2. Now the way you convert this to a mixed number is you do long division and you just keep the remainder. So 3/2, 3 is your dividend, and 2 is your divisor. 2 goes into 3 one time, 3 minus 2 is 1, and your remainder is 1. So the way you write this is this number is your whole number, so that's 1, and then you take your remainder over your denominator. So you see 3/2 converts to 1 1/2. Now a second one, it's a little bit more complicated. Let's look at, well, let's do 14/3. So 14 is your dividend, 3 is your divisor. 3 goes into 14 4 times. 4 times 3 is 12. Subtract, and you're left with 2. And so the solution is 4 remainder 2. So this, in mixed number form, is 4 2/3. Now, let's say we start with the fraction 4 2/3, and we want to go to an improper fraction, because there are some times, as you will see later, there are some times when it's useful to have a mixed number as an improper fraction. Now what you do here is you multiply the denominator of the fraction by the whole number and then add the numerator. So in this case, you have 3 times 4 quantity plus 2. And that's your numerator. And then your denominator is just whatever your original denominator was. So in this case, the denominator was 3. So you're left with 14/3. Now you'll notice that we took an improper fraction, converted it to a mixed number, and then took that same mixed number, and we got back the original improper fraction, 14/3. Okay, so that's what we have for simplification and mixed numbers. Why don't you try on your own, simplify let's go with 3/6 and 14/42, and then convert the mixed number 7 2/9 to improper fraction, and 65/9 to a mixed number. All right, try that on your own. All right, now let's talk about multiplication and division. Of the four elementary operations on fractions, these multiplication and division are the easiest. So let's just look at a very simple example. Let's take 1/2 and multiply it by 1/2. Now, the trick to multiplying and dividing fractions is you multiply the numerators together and multiply the denominators together. And so what you're left with is 1 times 1 on the top and 2 times 2 on the bottom, which gives you 1/4. Okay, let's look at one that's maybe a little bit more difficult. Let's take 3/4 times the improper fraction 7/3. Now, you multiply the numerators together, 3 times 7, and the denominators, 4 times 3. So this gives you 21/12. Now, it may not be initially obvious, but 21 and 12 have a common factor. That common factor is 3. You can write 21/12 as 7 times 3 over 4 times 3, as we saw over there. And you notice that the 3's cancel out, so you're left with 7/4. Now, you can multiply and then simplify, or you can do it the other way. If you notice right away, 3 over 4 times 7/3. You notice that the 3's cancel out right away. 3 divided by 3 is 1, and you're just left with 7/4. There are times when this is easier to use. There are times when it's easier to do it this way. However you do it is really up to you. Now, I'll show you a different one that's maybe not necessarily so obvious. Let's say we have 4/13 times, let's go 7/2. 7/2, that's a 2. And up here is a 7. So you can multiply 4 times 7 over 13 times 2, and you get 28/26. And this is 14 times 2. This is 13 times 2. 2's cancel out, and you're left with 14/13. The other way you can do it is if you realize over here, 4 and 2 both have a common factor of 2. So this becomes a 1, this becomes a 2. And you're left with 2/13 times 7/1. Multiply those together, 14/13. And as you see, if you make this cancellation right away, it's a one-step problem. If you don't, it's a lot more steps. It's a lot more difficult. So that's about all we have for multiplication. Let's talk about division. Now, division is the same thing as multiplication, but there's one extra step. If you're going to take the fraction 1/2 and divide that by 2/3, you can't actually divide something by a fraction. What you do is you multiply by its reciprocal. Now, the way you get the reciprocal is by flipping the numerator and the denominator. So in this case, the reciprocal of 2/3 is 3/2. And so 1/2 divided by 2/3 becomes 1/2 times 3/2. And then you just multiply that together, and 1 times 3 over 2 times 2 gives you 3/4. So that's basically all we have for multiplication and division. Why don't you try 2 problems on your own? Let's multiply 7/6 and 3/4. And why don't you divide 8/9 divided by 3/2? Why don't you try those on your own? All right, let's talk now about addition and subtraction. So let's take the example, let's do 7/3 plus 3/2. Now, with multiplication and division, you could multiply the numerator and multiply the denominator. But with addition and subtraction, you can't do that. What you have to do is find a common denominator, and the easiest way to do that is to find the least common multiple of your denominators. So in this case, our denominators are 3 and 2. So if you start writing out multiples of 3, 3 times 1 is 3, 6, 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9. Write out multiples of 2, 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6. Oh, look, we have a common multiple. So 2 times 3 equals 6. 3 times 2 equals 6. Now, we cannot change the fraction, so we must multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same value. So 7 over 3, if we multiply that by 2 over 2, that gives us our common denominator without changing the value of the fraction. And then 3 over 2 times 3 over 3 gives us 14/6 plus 9/6. And when you add the numerators together, 14 plus 9 is 23 divided by 6. And our fraction is 23/6. And since 23 is a prime number, this is the most reduced fraction you can get, and we can leave it as is. Now let's look at the same thing with subtraction. Let's do 8/5 minus 2/3. All right, again, we write out let's start with 3. Let's write out multiples of 3. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21. You can keep going as long as you think you need to. And let's look at multiples of 5. 5, 10, 15, and we have a match. So 5 times 3 equals 15, and 3 times 5 equals 15. So we have 8 over 5 times 3 over 3 minus 2 over 3 times 5 over 5. And so that is 24/15 minus 10/15, and then we have 14/15. Now 14 can be written as 7 times 2. 15 is 5 times 3. Notice that we have no common factors, so this is the lowest reduced form of this fraction, it's 14 over 15. Okay, so previously I gave you some on-your-own problems to do without my instruction, so now we're just going to go through the solutions. So the first one was to simplify 14 over 42. The easiest way to do this is to write the numerator and the denominator as multiples and try to find a common multiple. So 14 can be written as 7 times 2. 42 can be written as 14 times 3. But you notice that 14 can be broken down even farther. 7 times 2 on the top, 7 times 2 times 3 on the bottom. Now, as you see, the 2's cancel out, and the 7's also cancel out. So when you simplify this, it reduces to 1/3 in its lowest terms. All right, the next thing I wanted you to do was to convert 7 2/9 to an improper fraction. And if you remember the way to do this, you multiply the denominator of the fraction by the whole number and add the numerator. So 9 times 7, quantity plus 2. And then you divide that by the original denominator in the fraction. So that's over 9. And so 9 times 7 is 63 plus 2 over 9, which is just 65 over 9. Now, if you did your math correctly, you would realize that I gave you the same number in improper fraction and mixed number. So now we have to convert 65 ninths to a mixed number. And you do that by long division. So 65 is the dividend, 9 is the divisor. 9 goes into 65 7 times. 9 times 7 is 63. Subtract, you're left with a remainder of 2. And so, thus, 65 ninths becomes 7 and 2 ninths. Okay, then I asked you to multiply 7 sixths times 3 fourths. You may have multiplied first, or you may have realized that there is a common factor between 3 and 6. 3 and 6 reduces to 1 and 2, so this becomes 7 halves times 1 fourth, which gives you 7 times 1 over 2 times 4 equals 7 eighths. Now, for the divide, 8 ninths divided by 3 halves. Again, you have to, dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So this gives us 8 ninths times 2 thirds, which then gives us 8 times 2 over 9 times 3, 16 over 27. 16 has factors of 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16. 27 is 1, 3, 9, and 27. No common factors. This is the reduced form. We are done. Congratulations, you finished your first video on fractions.